Red Texas Horizon. Rosie Boone had spent her life trying to keep her father's ranch out of trouble, but when his debts landed in Beau Coulter's hands, she had no choice but to deal with the most feared cattle baron in Texas. He smirked, tipping his hat. "Your daddy lost the land, sweetheart," he murmured. "But I ain't here for that, I'm here for you." Chapter 1. The Shadow of Boone's Legacy. The Texas sun beat down on Rosie Boone with the same relentless intensity it had for the past 57 years of her life. Each wrinkle etched into her face, each strand of silver threading through her once fiery auburn hair, told a story of resilience, of a life lived under the vast, unforgiving sky of the frontier. She squinted, her gaze sweeping across the parched land, the rolling hills dotted with stubborn mesquite and the occasional, resilient longhorn. Boone Ranch. It was more than just land, it was a legacy, a burden, a promise she'd made to her dying mother years ago. The air, thick with the scent of dry earth and the distant, acrid tang of a brush fire, felt heavy on her chest. It wasn't just the heat, it was the weight of her father's debts, a crushing burden that had grown heavier with each passing season. Jedediah Boone, a man whose charm was as vast as the Texas plains and whose business sense was as barren as the desert, had gambled away more than money. He'd gambled away their future. Rosie gripped the worn leather reins of her horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Dusty, his coat the color of the land he roamed. The rhythmic creak of the saddle, the soft snorts of the horse, were familiar comforts in a world that felt increasingly uncertain. She'd ridden these lands since she was a girl, knew every dip and rise, every hidden spring and treacherous canyon. This land was in her blood, as much a part of her as her own beating heart. A plume of dust on the horizon caught her eye. Riders. At least 5, maybe more. Her heart, already heavy, sank further. It wasn't rustlers, she knew the look of them. This was something different, something organized. The way they rode, straight and purposeful, spoke of a different kind of threat. A threat that wore a star, perhaps, or worse, the cold, calculating gleam of a man who held all the cards. She urged Dusty into a slow trot, her hand instinctively resting on the worn butt of the Winchester rifle tucked into her saddle scabbard. It was an old rifle, her father's, but she knew how to use it. She'd had to more than once. Living on the frontier demanded a certain pragmatism. A woman alone, running a ranch the size of Boone's, had to be ready for anything. As the riders drew closer, she recognized the lead horse, a magnificent black stallion, and the man astride it.
Beau Coulter.
The name sent a shiver down her spine, a cold dread that settled in the pit of her stomach. Coulter was a legend, a myth whispered in hushed tones in saloons and around campfires. A cattle baron who had carved out an empire from nothing, a man rumored to be as ruthless as he was handsome. He was known for his piercing blue eyes, eyes that could cut through a man's soul, and a smile that promised both pleasure and pain. He was also known for collecting his debts, no matter the cost. They stopped a few yards from her, the horses kicking up a small cloud of dust that momentarily obscured the setting sun. Coulter dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size. He was tall, powerfully built, with shoulders that strained the seams of his worn leather jacket. His face, tanned and weathered, was framed by dark, unruly hair that curled slightly at the edges. A silver concho adorned his hatband, catching the fading light. He walked towards her, his spurs jingling softly with each step, a sound that echoed the growing unease in Rosie's heart. He stopped in front of her, his gaze unwavering, those infamous blue eyes holding hers captive. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice a low, resonant drawl that sent an unexpected tremor through her. It wasn't fear, not entirely. There was something else there, something she couldn't quite name. A strange mixture of apprehension and awareness. Rosie straightened in her saddle, her chin lifting slightly. "Mr. Coulter," she replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" The word felt bitter on her tongue. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Pleasure is a strong word, Miss Boone. I'm here on business." "I figured as much." She gestured towards the riders behind him. You brought quite the entourage for a simple business call. Precautions, he said, his gaze flicking to the rifle in her scabbard. A man in my position learns to be careful. And a woman in mine. He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. Touché, Miss Boone. You have your father's spirit, I'll give you that. My father's spirit got us into this mess, Rosie said, the words sharp, edged with years of frustration and resentment. Coulter's smile faded. Indeed. He owed me a considerable sum. A debt that, I'm afraid, has now fallen to you. Rosie had known this was coming, had dreaded it for months, but hearing the words spoken aloud, under the vast, indifferent sky, felt like a physical blow. I don't have the money, Mr. Coulter. You know that. He nodded, his gaze sweeping across the ranch, taking in the weathered buildings, the scattered cattle, the sheer, desolate beauty of it all. I do. Your father was quite thorough in his financial ruin. So what do you want? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. She knew the answer, had seen it in the way he looked at her, the way he assessed her, not as a debtor, but as something else. He took a step closer, his presence filling her vision, the scent of leather and dust, and something indefinably masculine reaching her. He reached out, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch, brief and unexpected, sent a jolt of electricity through her. Your daddy lost the land, sweetheart, he murmured, his voice low and intimate, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. But I ain't here for that, I'm here for you. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged, a promise and a threat all wrapped into one. Rosie stared at him, her mind reeling, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was trapped, caught between the legacy of her father's failures and the desires of a man who held her fate in his hands. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the land, and Rosie knew that her life, as she knew it, was over. A new, uncertain chapter was beginning, a chapter written in the dust and blood of the frontier, and at the center of it stood Beau Coulter, the man who had come to collect his debt. And she had a sinking feeling that the price he demanded would be far more than she could ever imagine. The silence felt so intense, almost as if time itself was holding its breath and waiting for the moment that the sun fully set. Chapter 2. Coulter's Claim. The last sliver of the sun vanished, leaving the plains awash in a bruised, purple twilight. The air, still warm from the day's heat, carried the mournful cry of a distant coyote, a sound that echoed the desolation in Rosie's heart. Coulter's words hung between them, a tangible presence, a challenge, and a proposition all in one. What do you mean? Rosie asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to maintain her composure. She knew what he meant, had seen the predatory gleam in his eyes, the possessive way he looked at her. But she needed to hear him say it, to force him to articulate the unspoken bargain he was offering. Coulter stepped back, giving her a sliver of space, but his gaze remained locked on hers, unwavering. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges worn and softened with age. He held it out to her. Your father's note, he said, his voice devoid of the earlier intimacy. It's all there in black and white. The amount he borrowed, the terms of the loan, and the collateral. Rosie took the paper, her fingers numb. She unfolded it slowly, the crispness of the paper a stark contrast to the trembling in her hands. She didn't need to read it, she knew what it said. She'd seen it before, the damning document that had sealed their fate. But she forced herself to look at the words, to confront the reality of her father's recklessness. The numbers swam before her eyes, a blur of ink and despair. The amount was staggering, more than the ranch was worth, more than she could ever hope to repay. And then, at the bottom, in her father's shaky handwriting, the final, devastating clause. In the event of default, the lender, Beau Coulter, shall have full claim to all assets of Boone Ranch, including the person of Rosalie Boone. Rosie's breath hitched in her throat. She'd known intellectually that this was a possibility, but to see it written down, so cold and impersonal, was a different kind of pain. It was a betrayal, not just by her father, but by the life she had known, the future she had envisioned. She looked up at Coulter, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and despair. "You knew," she said, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "You knew he couldn't pay. You planned this." Coulter's expression remained unreadable, his eyes like chips of ice in the fading light. "Your father was a gambler, Miss Boone. He made his choices. I simply offered him a chance. A chance to lose everything," Rosie retorted, her voice rising. "A chance to sell me like a prize heifer." "Don't be dramatic," Coulter said, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "I'm not a monster, Miss Boone. I'm a businessman. And you, Miss Boone, are an asset, stated in a legal and binding document. I'm a person," Rosie shot back, her fists clenching at her sides. "Not property. Not something to be bought and sold." He took a step closer again, his presence looming over her, his shadow falling across her like a shroud. "In the eyes of the law, Miss Boone, you are. And I intend to collect what is rightfully mine." The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the snorting of the horses and the distant rumble of thunder. A storm was brewing, both in the sky and in Rosie's heart. She was trapped, cornered, with no way out. But she wouldn't go down without a fight. "What if I refuse?" she asked, her voice defiant, even though she knew the futility of her words. Coulter smiled, a chilling expression that sent a shiver down her spine. "You can refuse, Miss Boone. But the consequences would be unpleasant. I have men, resources, and the law on my side. I could take this ranch by force, leave you with nothing. Is that what you want?" Rosie stared at him, her mind racing, searching for an escape, a loophole, anything. But there was nothing. She was at his mercy, a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. "What do you want from me?" she asked again, her voice softer this time, tinged with a hint of desperation. Coulter's gaze softened, a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, or perhaps just satisfaction, crossing his features. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. The touch, though unexpected, was not entirely unwelcome. It sent a confusing wave of warmth through her, a warmth that warred with the fear and anger that churned within her. "I want you to come with me," he said, his voice low and husky. "To my ranch. To live with me as my wife." The word hung in the air, heavy and shocking. Wife. The thought was absurd, preposterous, and yet a tiny part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, felt a flicker of something that wasn't entirely revulsion. It was a strange, unsettling mix of fear and curiosity. Rosie pulled away from his touch, her mind reeling. "Marriage? You expect me to marry you? A man I barely know, a man who stole everything from me?" "I offered your father a loan," Coulter corrected, his voice firm. "He chose to gamble it away. And as for knowing me, Miss Boone, we have plenty of time to get acquainted." "This is madness," Rosie whispered, shaking her head. I won't." "You have a choice, Miss Boone," Coulter said, his voice hardening again. "Marry me, and I'll ensure that Boone Ranch remains in your family. Your hands. Refuse, and you lose everything. Your home, your land, your legacy." He let the words sink in, the weight of their meaning crushing her. She looked out at the ranch, the land she loved, the land that held the memories of her family, her life. Could she abandon it? Could she walk away and leave it all to him? The storm clouds gathered overhead, the sky darkening with each passing moment. A flash of lightning illuminated Coulter's face, casting his features in stark relief, highlighting the determination in his eyes, the unwavering resolve in his stance. Rosie knew she had no choice. She was trapped, bound by her father's debt, by the harsh realities of the frontier, by the will of a man who held her future in his hands. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and steeled herself for the inevitable. "All right, Mr. Coulter," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm with a newfound resolve, the sound almost swallowed by the rising wind. "I'll marry you." The wind howled, the rain began to fall, and they shared an intense stare. Chapter 3. A bargain struck in dust. The rain lashed down, turning the dusty ground into a slick, muddy mire. The wind whipped Rosie's hair around her face, stinging her eyes, but she didn't flinch. She stood there, drenched and defiant, facing the man who had just become her betrothed, not through love or choice, but through a cruel twist of fate and a father's folly. Coulter's expression was unreadable in the stormy twilight. He hadn't expected her to agree so readily, had anticipated more resistance, more fight. He'd underestimated her, he realized, a mistake he rarely made. There was a steeliness in her gaze, a quiet strength that intrigued him. He'd bought her, yes, but he sensed that he hadn't broken her. Not yet. Wise decision, Miss Boone, he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the storm. You won't regret it. Regret? The word tasted like ashes in Rosie's mouth. She already regretted every moment of this cursed day, every decision her father had ever made that had led them to this point. But she wouldn't show him her weakness, wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Let's get out of this rain, Coulter said, gesturing towards a covered wagon that had been brought up by one of his men. We'll talk terms inside. Terms. The word was cold, transactional, a reminder that this was a business arrangement, not a marriage. Rosie followed him to the wagon, her boots sinking into the mud with each step. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, furnished with thick blankets and cushions. A lantern hanging from the roof cast a warm, flickering glow, illuminating the space. Coulter sat down opposite her, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He offered her a tin cup filled with something warm and strong-smelling.
Coffee, he said.
It'll take the chill off. Rosie took the cup, her hands trembling slightly. She sipped the coffee, grateful for the warmth that spread through her. It was bitter, but strong, and it helped to steady her nerves. So, Coulter said, leaning back against the cushions, his gaze fixed on her. The terms. I'll be straightforward, Miss Boone. I expect loyalty, obedience, and a certain level of cooperation. Rosie's jaw tightened. Cooperation? She repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. What does that entail, Mr. Coulter? Sharing your bed? Bearing your children? Coulter's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't flinch. Those are possibilities, Miss Boone. But for now, let's focus on the immediate future. You'll live at my ranch, the Bar C. You'll be treated with respect, provided for, but you'll follow my rules. No running off, no defying me. Understand? Rosie met his gaze, her eyes blazing. I understand that you think you own me, Mr. Coulter. But I'm not a slave. I'm your wife-to-be, and I expect to be treated as such. He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. You have spirit, Miss Boone. I admire that. But don't mistake my generosity for weakness. I can be a very generous husband or a very harsh one. The choice is yours. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Rosie knew that she was walking a tightrope, balancing between her pride and her survival. She had to play his game, for now, but she wouldn't surrender her spirit. She would find a way to navigate this new, treacherous landscape, to protect herself and her legacy. I need time, she said, her voice firm. Time to adjust. To say goodbye to my home. Coulter considered this for a moment, his gaze searching hers. He saw the pain in her eyes, the grief she was trying to hide. He wasn't a cruel man, despite his reputation. He could afford to be accommodating. You have 3 days, he said, his voice softening slightly. 3 days to settle your affairs, to pack your belongings. Then, I'll come back for you. 3 days. It wasn't much, but it was something. A brief respite before she was plunged into the unknown. And Boone Ranch? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. What happens to it? It remains yours, Coulter said, his gaze unwavering. As I promised. My men will oversee it, ensure it's properly managed. You'll have access to it, of course, but it will be under my protection. Protection. The word sounded more like a threat. She would be a prisoner on her own land, a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. And my father? She asked, the question she'd been dreading to ask. Where is he? Coulter's expression darkened. Your father is gone, Miss Boone. He left shortly after signing the note. I haven't seen him since.
Gone.
The word echoed in Rosie's heart, a hollow ache. She hadn't expected to see him again, had known that he was a coward, a man who would run from his responsibilities. But the finality of it, the knowledge that he had abandoned her without a backward glance, still stung. I see, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. She wouldn't grieve for him, not now. She had more pressing matters to attend to. The rain continued to fall, drumming against the roof of the wagon, a relentless rhythm that matched the turmoil in her heart. She looked at Coulter, at the man who held her fate in his hands, and wondered what the future held. She was a prisoner of circumstance, a bride by coercion, a woman caught in a web of debt and desire. But she was also Rosalie Boone, a woman of the frontier, a woman of strength and resilience. She would survive this. She would find a way to reclaim her life, her freedom, her legacy. She would not be broken. As the storm raged outside, a different kind of storm brewed within Rosie, a storm of defiance, of determination, of a will to survive. And as she looked into Coulter's eyes, she knew that this was just the beginning of their battle. A battle of wills, a battle of hearts, a battle fought on the dusty plains of Texas, under a sky that had witnessed countless struggles, countless triumphs, and countless tragedies. She felt a pull towards Coulter that she couldn't explain, a strange magnetic force that left her questioning everything. Chapter 4. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The 3 days passed in a blur of activity and suppressed emotion. Rosie moved through the familiar routines of ranch life like a ghost, her hands performing the tasks they had done for years, while her mind raced, trying to make sense of the upheaval that had shattered her world. She packed her belongings, carefully folding the clothes she had sewn herself, the worn books she had read countless times, the few precious mementos of her mother. Each item was a tangible reminder of the life she was leaving behind, a life that had been simple, but hers. The ranch hands, loyal men who had worked for her father for years, watched her with a mixture of sadness and concern. They knew the situation, had heard the rumors, the whispers that traveled on the wind across the vast plains. They offered their help, their condolences, their silent support. Old man Hemmings, the foreman, a grizzled veteran of countless cattle drives and frontier skirmishes, approached her on the second day, his weathered face etched with worry. "Miss Rosie," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We're with you, you know. Whatever you need, we'll do it. We ain't gonna let Coulter just take everything." Rosie looked at him, her eyes welling with tears. She appreciated their loyalty, their fierce protectiveness, but she knew they were powerless against Coulter's might. "Thank you, Hemmings," she said, her voice choked. "But there's nothing you can do. This is my burden to bear." "It ain't right, Miss Rosie," Hemmings said, his jaw clenched. "That man, he's got no right." "He has a piece of paper that says he does," Rosie replied, her voice bitter. "And in this land, that's all that matters." She spent hours wandering the ranch, revisiting the places that held special meaning for her. The creek where she had learned to swim, the old oak tree where she had carved her initials as a child, the small, neglected graveyard where her mother was buried. She stood by her mother's grave, the weathered headstone leaning slightly, the inscription barely legible. She talked to her, as she had done so many times before, pouring out her fears, her anger, her confusion. "Mama," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do.
I'm scared.
I don't want to leave, but I have no choice." The wind rustled through the dry grass, a soft sigh that seemed to offer a silent response. Rosie closed her eyes, drew strength from the memory of her mother's love, her resilience, her unwavering spirit. She spent the last evening in the old ranch house, sitting in the familiar rocking chair by the fireplace, the embers glowing softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken words, with the ghosts of the past. She thought of Coulter, of the strange, unsettling mixture of fear and fascination he evoked in her. She hated him, yes, for what he had done, for the way he had taken control of her life. But she also couldn't deny the awareness, the strange pull she felt towards him. He was a powerful man, a dangerous man, but there was something else there, something she couldn't quite decipher. A vulnerability, perhaps a hint of loneliness that mirrored her own. She wondered about his life, his past, the events that had shaped him into the man he was. What had made him so ruthless, so determined to acquire wealth and power? What secrets did he hide behind those piercing blue eyes? The thought of marrying him, of sharing his life, his bed, filled her with a mixture of dread and anticipation. It was a terrifying prospect, but also strangely intriguing. She was stepping into the unknown, into a world she didn't understand, a world where she would be at his mercy. But she wouldn't be a victim. She would be a survivor. She would learn the rules of this new game, and she would play it to win. She would protect her legacy, her land, her heart. She would not let Coulter break her. As the dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, Rosie rose from the rocking chair, her body stiff, her mind resolved. She dressed in her best riding clothes, a sturdy denim skirt and a crisp white shirt, a leather vest to ward off the morning chill. She braided her hair, securing it tightly at the nape of her neck. She looked at herself in the cracked mirror, her reflection staring back at her, a stranger in her own eyes. She was no longer just Rosalie Boone, rancher's daughter. She was Rosalie Boone, Coulter's claim, a woman on the verge of a new, uncertain life. She walked out of the ranch house, leaving behind the ghosts of the past, stepping into the dawn of a new day, a new chapter. She mounted Dusty, her faithful companion, and turned her face towards the rising sun, towards the future, towards the unknown. As she rode away from Boone Ranch, she knew that she was leaving a part of herself behind, a part that she would never fully recover. But she also knew that she was carrying something with her, something stronger, something more resilient. She was carrying the spirit of the frontier, the spirit of her mother, the spirit of Rosalie Boone. And that, she knew, was something that no man, not even Beau Coulter, could ever take away from her. The sound of the hooves hitting the dry soil felt final, and she fought tears. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Haunted Past. The journey to Coulter's ranch, the Barcy, was long and arduous. The landscape, vast and unforgiving, mirrored the turmoil in Rosie's heart. The endless expanse of rolling hills, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional, hardy oak, seemed to stretch on forever, a physical representation of the uncertain future that lay ahead. Coulter rode beside her, silent and watchful. He didn't speak much, but his presence was a constant, a reminder of the bargain they had struck, the life she was now bound to. He was a man of few words, she realized, a man who preferred to observe, to assess, to control. She stole glances at him, studying his profile, the strong jawline, the weathered lines around his eyes, the way his dark hair curled beneath his hat. He was a handsome man, undeniably so, but his beauty was harsh, rugged, like the landscape he ruled. There was a hardness in his eyes, a coldness that sent a shiver down her spine. But there were also moments, fleeting glimpses, when she saw something else. A flicker of vulnerability, a hint of sadness, a weariness that seemed to weigh him down. It was in those moments that she felt a flicker of something. Not sympathy, not yet, but perhaps understanding. They stopped for the night at a small, abandoned line shack, a relic of a bygone era. Coulter built a fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the weathered walls. He offered her food, jerky, and hardtack, simple fare but filling. They ate in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Rosie watched him, the way he moved, the way he held himself, the way he seemed to command the very space around him. He was a force of nature, a man who had carved his own destiny from the harsh realities of the frontier. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, breaking the silence, her voice tentative. Coulter looked at her, his blue eyes piercing in the firelight. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I want to know what I'm getting myself into." He chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "The Barcy is extensive. Thousands of acres, thousands of head of cattle. It's a demanding life, Miss Boone. but a rewarding one. And you built it all yourself? She asked, her curiosity piqued. He nodded, his gaze drifting towards the fire, his eyes reflecting the flames. From nothing. I came here with nothing but the clothes on my back and a dream. A dream? Rosie repeated, her voice soft. A dream of something more, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A dream of escaping the past. The past. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Rosie sensed a story there, a story of pain and hardship, a story that had shaped him into the man he was. What past? She asked, her voice gentle, hesitant. Coulter looked at her, his eyes guarded, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to reveal a part of himself, a part he kept hidden from the world. A past filled with regrets, he said, his voice low and strained. A past I'd rather forget. Rosie saw the pain in his eyes, the flicker of vulnerability that he quickly masked. She felt a stirring of empathy, a connection to this man who seemed so cold and distant. We all have regrets, Mr. Coulter, she said, her voice soft. Things we wish we could change, choices we wish we hadn't made. He looked at her, his gaze searching hers. You too, Miss Boone? She nodded, her gaze drifting towards the fire, her own memories surfacing, unwanted but unavoidable. Yes. My father, he made a lot of mistakes. Mistakes that cost us everything. But you stayed, Coulter said, his voice quiet. You didn't run. I had nowhere to run, Rosie replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. And I had a promise to keep. A promise? To my mother, Rosie said, her voice choked with emotion. She loved this land. She made me promise to take care of it, to never let it go. Coulter nodded, his gaze understanding. Loyalty. It's a powerful thing, Miss Boone. A rare thing. And you, Mr. Coulter? Rosie asked, her voice challenging. Do you value loyalty? He met her gaze, his eyes intense. Above all else, Miss Boone. Loyalty and trust. Those are the foundations of everything I've built. The words hung in the air, a silent promise, a challenge, a test. Rosie knew that she was entering a world where loyalty was paramount, where trust was earned, not given. She would have to prove herself, to earn his respect, his trust. As the night wore on, they talked, haltingly at first, then with a growing ease. They talked about the land, about cattle, about the challenges of frontier life. They shared stories, fragments of their pasts, glimpses into their souls. Rosie learned that Coulter had come from a poor family, that he had lost his parents at a young age, that he had fought his way up from nothing, clawing his way to success with grit and determination. He learned that Rosie had been raised on the ranch, that she had been educated by her mother, that she was a skilled horsewoman, a capable rancher, a woman of intelligence and strength. As they talked, the distance between them seemed to shrink, the barriers they had erected slowly crumbling. They were still strangers in many ways, but they were also beginning to understand each other, to see each other, not as adversaries, but as fellow travelers on this harsh, unforgiving frontier. By the time the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, a fragile truce had been established, a tentative understanding forged in the crucible of shared hardship and unspoken words. They set off again, the Barcy still a day's ride away. Rosie rode beside Coulter, her heart still heavy, but with a glimmer of hope, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning. The sound of their horses' hooves seemed different now, less like a death knell. Chapter 6. Beneath a Sky of Secrets. The Barcy Ranch sprawled across the horizon, a vast empire of rolling hills, verdant pastures, and shimmering streams. It was a stark contrast to the weathered, struggling Boone Ranch, a testament to Coulter's success, his ambition, his ruthless determination. As they approached the ranch headquarters, Rosie's breath caught in her throat. The main house, a sprawling two-story structure built of stone and timber, dominated the landscape. It was grand, imposing, a symbol of power and wealth. Corrals, barns, and outbuildings dotted the surrounding area, bustling with activity. Ranch hands, cowboys, and house servants moved about, their faces etched with a mixture of respect and fear. Coulter led her through the main gate, the iron archway emblazoned with the Bar C brand, a symbol that spoke of ownership, of control, of a legacy built on blood, sweat, and perhaps a touch of ruthlessness. He dismounted in front of the house, his movements fluid and graceful. He turned to her, his blue eyes searching hers. "Welcome to the Bar C, Miss Boone," he said, his voice formal, but with a hint of something else.
Frida?
Satisfaction? Possession? Rosie dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride. She stood there, taking in the scene, feeling a mixture of awe and trepidation. This was her new home, her new life, a world vastly different from anything she had ever known. A woman emerged from the house, her face etched with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. She was tall and slender, with sharp features and piercing gray eyes. Her hair, streaked with silver, was pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple, but elegant, gray dress, a silver brooch pinned at her throat. "Beau," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative.
Who is this?
Coulter turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Mother, this is Miss Rosalie Boone, my future wife." The woman's eyes widened slightly, her gaze sweeping over Rosie, assessing her, judging her. There was a flicker of something that might have been surprise, or perhaps disappointment. "Your wife?" she repeated, her voice laced with skepticism. "I wasn't aware you were courting." "It was a sudden decision, Mother," Coulter said, his voice evasive. "Circumstances dictated it." The woman's gaze narrowed, her eyes fixed on Rosie. "Circumstances?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "What circumstances?" Rosie felt a flush creep up her cheeks. She knew what the woman was thinking, what everyone would be thinking. She was the debt bride, the woman who had been bought, the woman who had traded her freedom for her family's land. "It's a long story, Mrs. Coulter," Rosie said, her voice firm, meeting the woman's gaze. "But I assure you, I'm not here to cause any trouble." The woman's expression remained unreadable, her eyes cold and distant. "I expect not, Miss Boone. The Bar C is a respectable establishment. We have a reputation to uphold." Rosie's jaw tightened. She sensed a challenge, a warning, a subtle threat. This woman, Coulter's mother, was a formidable presence, a woman who wielded power and influence, a woman who would not easily accept an outsider into her domain. "I understand, Mrs. Coulter," Rosie said, her voice polite but firm. "I'll do my best to adapt." Coulter intervened, his voice soothing. "Mother, please. Miss Boone is tired from the journey. Let's show her to her room. Allow her to rest." The woman hesitated for a moment, her gaze still fixed on Rosie. Then she nodded curtly. "Very well. Follow me, Miss Boone." She turned and led Rosie into the house, her back ramrod straight, her footsteps echoing on the polished wooden floors. The interior was grand, opulent, filled with expensive furniture, fine rugs, and ornate decorations. It was a world away from the simple, rustic charm of the Boone Ranch house. Rosie followed Mrs. Coulter up a sweeping staircase, her hand trailing along the smooth mahogany banister. They reached a long hallway, lined with doors. Mrs. Coulter stopped in front of one, opening it to reveal a spacious, elegantly furnished room. "This will be your room, Miss Boone," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "Dinner is at 7. Be punctual." She turned and left, closing the door behind her, leaving Rosie alone in her new surroundings. The room was beautiful, with a large four-poster bed, a plush armchair, a writing desk, and a window that offered a stunning view of the ranch. But it felt cold, impersonal, a gilded cage. Rosie sank onto the bed, feeling overwhelmed by the events of the past few days. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and utterly alone. She longed for the familiar comfort of her own home, for the simple routines of her old life. But she knew that she couldn't dwell on the past. She had to adapt, to survive, to find a way to navigate this new, treacherous world. She had to learn the rules, the customs, the secrets of the Bar C. She rose from the bed, walked to the window, and gazed out at the vast expanse of land that was now, in a way, hers. She saw the cattle grazing in the distance, the cowboys riding the range, the endless skies stretching above. It was a beautiful sight, a scene of peace and tranquility. But Rosie knew that beneath the surface, there were currents of tension, of secrets, of unspoken conflicts. She was now a part of this world, a player in this game, and she had to learn to play it well. She would uncover the secrets of the Bar C, the secrets of Coulter's past, the secrets of his mother's disapproval. She would find her place in this new world, carve out her own destiny, protect her legacy. She would not be a victim. She would be a survivor. She would be Rosalie Boone, mistress of the Bar C, a woman of the frontier, a woman of strength and resilience. And as she looked out at the setting sun, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, she knew that her journey had just begun. The house felt silent, and she wondered how many secrets it held within its stone facade. Chapter 7. The Price of Redemption. Dinner at the Bar C was a formal affair, a stark contrast to the simple meals Rosie had shared with her father and the ranch hands back at Boone Ranch. The dining room, a large, imposing space with a long mahogany table, crystal chandeliers, and portraits of stern-faced Coulter ancestors adorning the walls, was intimidating. Rosie dressed carefully, choosing a simple, but elegant, blue dress that had belonged to her mother. She brushed her hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders, a small act of defiance against the formality of the occasion. She arrived at the dining room punctually, finding Coulter and his mother already seated at the table. Mrs. Coulter, dressed in a severe black gown, gave her a curt nod of acknowledgement. Coulter, however, rose from his chair, a flicker of something in his eyes. Appreciation? Approval? "You look lovely, Miss Boone," he said, his voice low, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Rosie felt a blush creep up her cheeks. It was the first compliment he had paid her, the first time he had acknowledged her as anything other than a possession. "Thank you, Mr. Coulter," she replied, her voice steady, despite the fluttering in her chest. He pulled out a chair for her, his hand brushing her arm as he did so. The touch, brief and accidental, sent a jolt of electricity through her. She sat down, trying to ignore the strange sensation, the unfamiliar awareness of his proximity. The meal was served by silent, efficient servants, a procession of courses that were both elaborate and unfamiliar. Rosie ate sparingly, her appetite diminished by the tension in the room, the weight of unspoken words. Mrs. Coulter dominated the conversation, directing a series of pointed questions at Rosie, probing her background, her upbringing, her suitability as a wife for her son. "So, Miss Boone," she said, her voice sharp, her gaze piercing. "Tell me about your family. Your father, I understand, was a rancher?" "Yes," Rosie replied, her voice firm, meeting the woman's gaze. "He owned Boone Ranch. It's been in our family for generations." "And he lost it?" Mrs. Coulter said, her voice laced with disdain. "To my son?" Rosie's jaw tightened. "He encountered some financial difficulties," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Mr. Coulter offered him a loan. A loan he couldn't repay," Mrs. Coulter said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And so, you offered yourself as collateral?" Rosie felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger. She wanted to lash out, to defend herself, to explain the circumstances, but she knew it would be futile. This woman had already made up her mind about her. "It was a necessary arrangement," Rosie said, her voice tight, "to protect my family's land." "A noble sacrifice," Mrs. Coulter said, her voice dripping with irony. "Or perhaps a desperate one." Coulter intervened, his voice firm. "Mother, that's enough. Miss Boone's past is her own business. We're here to get acquainted, not to interrogate her." Mrs. Coulter gave her son a sharp look, but she subsided, turning her attention to her food. The silence that followed was heavy, awkward, filled with unspoken tension. Rosie felt a surge of gratitude towards Coulter for defending her, for silencing his mother's cruel barbs. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. It showed that he wasn't entirely indifferent to her feelings, that he recognized her as a person, not just a commodity. After dinner, Coulter excused himself, saying he had some business to attend to. Mrs. Coulter retired to her room, leaving Rosie alone in the vast, silent house. She wandered through the rooms, exploring her new surroundings, feeling like an intruder in this opulent, unfamiliar world. She found a library, a large, book-lined room with a fireplace and comfortable armchairs. She spent hours there, browsing the shelves, losing herself in the pages of a book, trying to escape the reality of her situation. As she was about to leave, she noticed a small, leather-bound journal tucked away on a shelf. She pulled it out, her curiosity piqued. It was old, the pages yellowed and brittle. She opened it, her heart pounding, and began to read. It was Coulter's journal, from years ago, when he was a young man, just starting out on his journey to build the Bar C. The entries were raw, honest, filled with ambition, determination, and pain. He wrote of his childhood, of the poverty and hardship he had endured, of the loss of his parents, of his burning desire to escape his past, to create a better life for himself. He wrote of his struggles, his setbacks, his triumphs. He wrote of the people he had met, the friends he had made, the enemies he had encountered. And then, she found an entry that made her heart ache. He wrote of a woman he had loved, a woman he had lost. Her name was Sarah, and she had died of a fever, leaving him heartbroken and alone. Rosie closed the journal, her eyes filled with tears. She understood now. The source of his pain, the reason for his ruthlessness, his determination to control everything, to protect himself from further hurt. He had loved, and he had lost. And the price of that loss had been a hardening of his heart, a closing off of his emotions. She realized that she was not the only one with a haunted past, with secrets and regrets. Coulter, too, carried a burden, a weight of unspoken grief. She put the journal back on the shelf, her heart filled with a strange mixture of sadness and understanding. She was beginning to see him, not just as the man who had taken her freedom, but as a human being flawed and vulnerable, a man who had suffered, a man who had loved, a man who was, perhaps, capable of redemption. She left the library, her mind racing, her heart aching. She knew that she had stumbled upon a secret, a truth that could change everything. She knew that she had to tread carefully, to understand him, to reach him, to break through the walls he had built around his heart. She held back a sob that was building up inside her. Chapter 8. Whispers Across the Mesa. The following days settled into a strange, uneasy rhythm. Rosie explored the Bar C, familiarizing herself with its vastness, its operations, its people. She rode Dusty across the rolling hills, feeling a sense of freedom, a connection to the land that was both familiar and new. She interacted with the ranch hands, the cowboys, the house servants, observing their interactions, listening to their conversations, trying to understand the dynamics of this complex, hierarchical world. She learned that Coulter was respected, feared, and in some ways admired. He was a hard man, a demanding boss, but he was also fair, just, and protective of his people. He had built the Bar C from nothing, through sheer will and determination, and he had earned the loyalty of those who worked for him. But there were also whispers, rumors, hints of a darker side to his past, of ruthless dealings, of enemies made, of blood spilled. Rosie heard these whispers, these fragments of stories, and she wondered about the truth, about the man behind the legend, the man behind the mask. She saw little of Coulter, who was often away, overseeing the ranch, dealing with business matters, attending to the myriad responsibilities of a man who controlled a vast empire. When they did meet, it was usually at dinner, formal, strained affairs, dominated by Mrs. Coulter's cold scrutiny and pointed questions. But there were also moments, fleeting glimpses, when Rosie saw a different side of him. A flicker of warmth in his eyes, a hint of a smile on his lips, a moment of shared understanding. One evening, she found him in the stables, tending to his black stallion, Diablo. He was brushing the horse's coat, his movements gentle, almost tender. He looked up as she approached, his expression guarded. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice neutral. "What brings you here?" I was just exploring," Rosie replied, her voice hesitant. "I love horses." He nodded, his gaze returning to Diablo. "He's a magnificent animal," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Strong, fast, loyal. Like his owner?" Rosie said, her voice soft, a hint of a question in her tone. Coulter looked at her, his blue eyes piercing. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. They stood there for a moment, in silence, the only sound the soft snorting of the horse and the distant calls of the cowboys. I read your journal," Rosie said, her voice barely a whisper, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Coulter's eyes widened slightly, his expression hardening. "You what?" Rosie felt a flush creep up her cheeks. She knew she had overstepped, had invaded his privacy, but she couldn't take the words back. "I found it in the library," she said, her voice trembling.
Y I'm sorry.
"I shouldn't have." He took a step towards her, his presence looming over her, his shadow falling across her. "Why did you read it?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Rosie met his gaze, her eyes unwavering, despite the fear that churned within her. "I wanted to understand you," she said, her voice firm. "To understand why you are the way you are." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher her motives, her sincerity. "And what did you learn?" he asked, his voice softening slightly. "I learned that you've suffered," Rosie said, her voice gentle. "That you've loved and lost. That you've built walls around your heart to protect yourself." He looked away, his gaze drifting towards the open doorway of the stable, towards the vast expanse of the ranch, the setting sun painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. "The past is the past, Miss Boone," he said, his voice strained. "It's best left buried." "But it shapes us, Mr. Coulter," Rosie said, her voice soft. "It makes us who we are. We can't escape it, no matter how hard we try." He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and something else. "Resignation? Acceptance? And you, Miss Boone?" he asked, his voice quiet. "What shapes you? What are your ghosts?" Rosie hesitated for a moment, then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My mother," she said, "her love for the land, her belief in me. My father, his failures, his betrayal. My promise to protect what's left." He nodded, his gaze understanding. "We're both haunted, Miss Boone," he said, his voice low. "By the past, by our choices, by the things we can't change." They stood there, in the fading light, two souls connected by their shared pain, their shared burdens, their shared humanity. The silence between them was no longer awkward, strained, but comfortable, almost intimate. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the land, Rosie felt a shift, a subtle change in the dynamic between them. The barriers were still there, but they were crumbling, slowly but surely. She knew that she was still his prisoner, in a way, but she was also beginning to see him as something more than her captor. He was a man, flawed and complex, with a past that haunted him, a heart that had been broken. And she, Rosalie Boone, was beginning to understand him, to see him, to connect with him. It was a dangerous game, she knew, a game with high stakes, but she couldn't help herself. She was drawn to him, to his strength, his vulnerability, his humanity. She knew that she had to tell someone about the journal, to break the tension that was building inside. Chapter 9. Scars of the Frontier. The vastness of the Bar Sea held more than just cattle and land. It held stories, etched into the landscape like scars on weathered skin. Rosie, seeking solace and a connection to something familiar, found herself drawn to the oldest part of the ranch, a small, almost forgotten cemetery nestled behind a copse of cottonwood trees. It was a place where the past whispered on the wind, where the echoes of lives lived and lost lingered in the air. She visited the cemetery often, drawn by a sense of shared solitude, a kinship with those who had come before her, those who had faced the harsh realities of the frontier and succumbed to its unforgiving embrace. She cleaned the weathered headstones, pulling weeds and placing wildflowers on the forgotten graves. One afternoon, while tending to a particularly old grave, marked only by a simple wooden cross. She heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting to see one of the ranch hands, but instead found Coulter standing there, his expression unreadable. "Miss Boone," he said, his voice neutral. "I didn't expect to find you here." "I like it here," Rosie replied, her voice hesitant. "It's peaceful." He nodded, his gaze sweeping across the cemetery, taking in the weathered headstones, the gnarled trees, the sense of timeless solitude. "It's where the past resides," he said, his voice low. "Where the stories of the Bar C are buried." He walked towards her, stopping beside the grave she had been tending. He looked at the simple wooden cross, his expression softening slightly. "This was my sister," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Mary. She died when she was just a child." Rosie's heart ached for him. She had seen the entry in his journal, the brief mention of his sister, the pain of his loss. She hadn't realized she was buried here on the ranch. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice gentle. "It must have been hard." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the cross, his eyes filled with a distant sadness. "She was everything to me," he said, his voice strained. "My parents, they were gone most of the time working. Mary, she was my only friend, my only family." Rosie saw the vulnerability in him, the raw, unhealed wound that he kept hidden from the world. She felt a surge of empathy, a connection to this man who seemed so cold and distant. "And Sarah?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. "Is she here too?" Coulter's eyes widened slightly, his expression hardening. He turned to her, his gaze piercing.
"How do you?"
he began, his voice tight. "Your journal," Rosie said, her voice apologetic. "I told you I read it." He looked away, his jaw clenched, his fists clenched at his sides. He was angry. She knew, at her intrusion, at her uncovering of his secrets. "She's not here," he said, his voice cold. "She's buried elsewhere. Where she died." He didn't elaborate, and Rosie didn't press him. She sensed that the story of Sarah's death was a painful one, a wound that had never fully healed. They stood there for a moment, in silence, the only sound the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees, the mournful cry of a distant hawk. "I understand loss," Rosie said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. "My mother, she's buried on Boone Ranch. I visit her grave often." Coulter looked at her, his gaze softening slightly. He saw the pain in her eyes, the grief she was trying to hide. He realized that they were not so different, after all, two souls scarred by loss, by the harsh realities of the frontier. "We carry our dead with us, Miss Boone," he said, his voice low. "They shape us, they haunt us, they define us. But we can't let them consume us," Rosie said, her voice firm. "We have to find a way to move forward, to live, to honor their memory." He nodded, his gaze searching hers. He saw the strength in her, the resilience, the unwavering spirit. He admired her, he realized, for her courage, for her compassion, for her ability to see beyond his mask, to understand his pain. He reached out, his hand brushing her cheek, his touch gentle, almost tentative. It was the first time he had touched her willingly, without the pretense of ownership, without the shadow of their bargain hanging over them. Rosie felt a jolt of electricity at his touch, a warmth that spread through her, a strange, unsettling sensation that she couldn't quite define. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. A connection, a spark, a flicker of hope in the darkness. He withdrew his hand, his expression shifting, becoming guarded once more. The moment was broken, the intimacy shattered. "We should get back," he said, his voice neutral. "It's getting late." They walked back to the ranch house in silence, the unspoken words, the unacknowledged emotions, hanging heavy between them. But something had changed, shifted between them. A barrier had been breached, a connection forged, a spark ignited. The cemetery felt different now. It felt like hallowed ground and shared experience. Chapter 10. A glimmer of hope's light. The tentative connection forged in the cemetery lingered, an unspoken understanding that softened the edges of their strained relationship. Rosie found herself seeking out Coulter's company, drawn to his quiet strength, his hidden vulnerability, his surprising moments of gentleness. She began to accompany him on his rounds of the ranch, observing his interactions with the hands, learning the intricate workings of the Barsi, absorbing the vastness of his empire. She saw his dedication, his commitment, his unwavering focus on the land and the people who depended on him. She also saw his loneliness, the isolation that came with his position, the burden of responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He had built this empire, but he had built it alone, surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. Rosie started to integrate herself into the daily life of the ranch, not as a captive, but as a participant. She helped in the kitchen, learning the preferences of the household, the routines of the servants, the demands of Mrs. Coulter. She tended to the garden, finding solace in the familiar tasks of planting, weeding, nurturing. She brought fresh flowers into the house, adding a touch of color and life to the somber, formal rooms. She even began to interact with Mrs. Coulter, cautiously at first, then with a growing confidence. She saw the woman's loneliness, her bitterness, her resentment towards the son who had surpassed her, who had built an empire she could only dream of. Rosie realized that Mrs. Coulter was not simply a cruel, disapproving woman, but a complex, flawed individual shaped by her own disappointments, her own unfulfilled ambitions. She was a woman who had lost her husband, her position, her purpose. One afternoon, Rosie found Mrs. Coulter in the sewing room, working on a piece of needlepoint. The room, filled with fabrics, threads, and sewing implements, was a testament to the woman's skill, her artistry, her confinement. "Mrs. Coulter," Rosie said, her voice hesitant. "May I join you?" Mrs. Coulter looked up, her expression surprised, then guarded. "If you wish, Miss Boone." Rosie sat down opposite her, picking up a piece of fabric, a discarded scrap of silk. She began to fold it, pleat it, shaping it into a small, delicate flower. "You have a talent for this, Miss Boone," Mrs. Coulter said, her voice grudgingly admiring. "My mother taught me," Rosie replied, her voice soft. "She was a skilled seamstress." "And your father?" Mrs. Coulter asked, her voice sharp. "What did he teach you?" Rosie hesitated for a moment, then she spoke, her voice firm. "He taught me the importance of resilience," she said. "Of surviving, no matter the cost." Mrs. Coulter looked at her, her gaze searching. She saw the strength in Rosie's eyes, the determination, the unwavering spirit. She saw a woman who had faced hardship, who had endured loss, who had survived. "You remind me of myself," Mrs. Coulter said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "When I was younger." Before she didn't finish the sentence, but Rosie understood. Before life had broken her, before disappointment had hardened her heart, before she had become the cold, bitter woman she was today. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the rustle of fabric, the soft click of needles. A fragile truce had been established, a tentative understanding forged in the shared space of feminine creativity. As the days turned into weeks, Rosie found herself settling into a new routine, a new life. She was no longer a prisoner, not entirely, but a participant, a member of the household, a woman carving out her own space in this vast, complex world. She and Coulter continued to share moments of quiet connection, of unspoken understanding. They rode together, worked together, shared meals together, their conversations becoming less strained, more natural. One evening, after dinner, they found themselves alone in the library. Coulter was standing by the fireplace, gazing into the flames, his expression pensive. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about Boone Ranch." Rosie's heart quickened. "What about it?" "It needs attention," he said. "It's been neglected. It needs you." Rosie looked at him, her eyes wide. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you should go back," he said. "Oversee the repairs, the improvements. Make it your own again." Rosie was stunned. She hadn't expected this, hadn't dared to hope for it. It was a gesture of trust, of respect, of something more. "But your mother," she began, hesitant. "My mother will adjust," Coulter said, his voice firm. "This is the right thing to do. For you, for the ranch, for us." The word "us" hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was the first time he had acknowledged their connection, their shared future, their potential. Rosie felt a surge of hope, a glimmer of light in the darkness. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning. A chance to rebuild, to reclaim, to create something new. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Beau." It was the first time she had used his given name, the first time she had acknowledged him as a man, not just as her captor, her husband-to-be. He looked at her, his blue eyes softening, a hint of a smile on his lips. "You're welcome, Rosalie." It was the first time he had used her given name, the first time he had acknowledged her as a woman, not just as a possession. The exchange felt significant, a turning point, and the horizon felt like it was filled with hope. Chapter 11. The Thorns of Rosalie's Heart. Returning to Boone Ranch was a bittersweet homecoming. The familiar landscape, the weathered buildings, the scent of dry earth and mesquite evoked a flood of memories, both joyful and painful. It was the place she had known and loved, the place where she had grown up, the place where her mother was buried, the place where her father had betrayed her. She arrived with a small contingent of Bar C hands, sent by Coulter to assist with the repairs and improvements. Hemmings, the old foreman, greeted her with a mixture of relief and wariness. "Miss Rosie," he said, his weathered face creased with concern. "It's good to see you back. But what's the situation?" "Coulter, he's letting me manage the ranch." "Hemmings," Rosie said, her voice firm. "He's given me his trust." Hemmings looked skeptical, his eyes narrowed. "Trust? That man? I don't trust him, as far as I can spit." "I know, Hemmings," Rosie said, her voice patient. "But things are changing. He's different than I thought." Hemmings grunted, unconvinced, but he didn't argue. He knew Rosie's stubbornness, her determination, her unwavering spirit. He would follow her lead, even if he didn't agree with it. Rosie set to work immediately, assessing the damage, prioritizing the repairs, organizing the hands. She threw herself into the work, finding solace in the familiar tasks, the physical labor, the connection to the land. She spent hours riding the range, checking the fences, inspecting the cattle, rediscovering the rhythm of ranch life. She felt a sense of purpose, of belonging, of freedom. But there were also moments of doubt, of fear, of confusion. She missed Coulter, more than she cared to admit. She missed his quiet presence, his strength, his unexpected moments of gentleness. She missed the conversations they had shared, the unspoken understanding that had developed between them, the fragile connection that had been forged in the crucible of their shared pasts. She found herself thinking of him constantly, wondering what he was doing, how he was feeling, whether he missed her too. It was a dangerous game, she knew, a game with high stakes, but she couldn't help herself. She was drawn to him, despite everything, despite the circumstances of their arrangement. She visited her mother's grave often, seeking solace, guidance, a connection to the woman who had shaped her life, who had instilled in her a love for the land, a belief in herself. "Mama," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm back. I'm trying to make things right, but I'm confused. I don't know what to feel. I think I'm falling for him." The wind rustled through the dry grass, a soft sigh that seemed to offer a silent response. Rosie closed her eyes, drew strength from the memory of her mother's love, her resilience, her unwavering spirit. She knew that she was walking a tightrope, balancing between her loyalty to her family, her love for the land, and her growing feelings for Coulter. It was a precarious position, a dangerous game, but she was determined to play it to win. She would rebuild Boone Ranch, reclaim her legacy, protect her heritage. But she would also explore this new, unexpected emotion, this connection with Coulter. She would see where it led, what it meant, whether it was real. One evening, as she was sitting on the porch of the old ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and purple, she heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her heart quickened. She knew who it was. Coulter rode into the yard, dismounting with his usual fluid grace. He looked tired, his face etched with the lines of fatigue, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. Rosalie, he said, his voice low, his gaze lingering on her. Beau, she replied, her voice soft, her heart fluttering in her chest. He walked towards her, his spurs jingling softly with each step, a sound that echoed the rhythm of her heart. He stopped in front of her, his presence filling her vision, the scent of leather and dust, and something indefinably masculine reaching her. "How is it?" he asked, his voice gentle, his gaze sweeping across the ranch, taking in the improvements, the signs of renewed life. "It's coming along," Rosie replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Thanks to you." He nodded, his gaze returning to her. "It's your home, Rosalie," he said. "It always will be." They stood there for a moment, in silence, the unspoken words, the unacknowledged emotions, hanging heavy between them. The air felt charged, electric, filled with a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Rosie felt thorns, literally, growing inside her, trying to fight the rose inside her, the one trying to love. Chapter 12. Coulter's Hidden Wounds. The days that followed Coulter's visit were filled with a renewed sense of purpose for Rosie. She worked tirelessly, overseeing the repairs, managing the ranch hands, making plans for the future. But her mind was often elsewhere, replaying her conversation with Coulter, analyzing every word, every gesture, every unspoken emotion. She knew that he was changing, softening, opening up to her. She had seen glimpses of his vulnerability, his hidden pain, his capacity for love. But she also knew that he was still a man of secrets, a man with a past that haunted him, a man who guarded his heart fiercely. One afternoon, while riding back from checking the fences, she encountered Hemmings, his face etched with concern. "Miss Rosie," he said, his voice low. "There's been trouble. Rustlers. They hit the north pasture last night. Took about 50 head. Rosie's heart sank. Rustlers were a constant threat on the frontier, a danger that every rancher faced. But this felt personal, a deliberate act of aggression, a challenge to her authority, to Coulter's protection. "Did you see them?" she asked, her voice tight. Hemmings shook his head.
"No, ma'am."
"They were gone by the time we got there. But they left a message." He handed her a small, folded piece of paper, the edges blackened with soot. Rosie unfolded it, her heart pounding. It was a single word, scrawled in crude lettering, Coulter. Rosie felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just a random act of theft, it was a warning, a threat, a direct challenge to Coulter. It was a reminder that he had enemies, that his past was not forgotten, that his power was not absolute. She knew that she had to tell him, to warn him, to protect him. It was a strange, unfamiliar feeling, this protectiveness towards the man who had once been her captor, her enemy. But it was real, undeniable, a testament to the changing dynamic between them. She rode back to the ranch house, her mind racing. She found a fresh horse, sent a message to the Bar C with one of the hands, requesting Coulter's presence, and then set off, riding hard, towards the north pasture, towards the scene of the crime, towards the truth. She arrived at the pasture as the sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the land. She saw the signs of the rustler's passage, the trampled grass, the broken fences, the absence of the cattle. She dismounted, her legs stiff, her heart heavy. She walked along the trail, searching for clues, for anything that might shed light on the identity of the rustlers, on their motives, on their connection to Coulter. She found a small, silver object lying in the dirt, half hidden beneath a clump of grass. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was a concho, a decorative silver ornament, similar to the one Coulter wore on his hatband. But this one was different, unique, with a distinctive design, a symbol she had never seen before. She recognized it, though, from somewhere. A memory, a fleeting glimpse, a whisper. It was a symbol associated with a rival ranch, the Diamondback, owned by a man named Jedediah Stone. Stone was a name Rosie had heard mentioned in hushed tones, a name associated with violence, with ruthlessness, with a long-standing feud with Coulter. A feud that went back years, a feud that had its roots in the past. Rosie felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. She knew that this was more than just a cattle raid. It was a personal vendetta, a challenge to Coulter's authority, a threat to his life. And she, Rosalie Boone, was caught in the middle, a pawn in a dangerous game, a woman torn between her loyalty to her family, her love for the land, and her growing feelings for Coulter. She mounted her horse, her mind racing. She had to get back to the ranch house, to wait for Coulter, to warn him, to protect him. She rode through the gathering darkness, the wind whipping her hair around her face, the stars above her a silent witness to her fear, her determination, her love. She knew that she was riding into a storm of violence, of secrets, of reckoning. The sound of her horse hitting the ground felt more intense, more significant. Chapter 13. Broken Trust and Bitter Truths. Coulter arrived at Boone Ranch under the cloak of a moonless night, his face grim, his eyes like chips of ice. The news of the rustling, the message left behind, had reached him swiftly, confirming his deepest fears. He'd known this day might come, had sensed the simmering threat that lay beneath the surface of his carefully constructed world. Rosie met him at the door, her face pale but resolute. She held out the silver concho, the evidence of Stone's involvement, the symbol of a past that refused to stay buried. "It's Stone," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm with conviction. "He's behind this." Coulter took the concho, his fingers tightening around it, his knuckles turning white. He recognized the symbol, the mark of his old enemy, the man who had sworn vengeance, the man who had taken everything from him. "I know," he said, his voice low and dangerous, a rumble of barely suppressed rage. "I've known it all along." He turned to her, his gaze intense, searching hers. "How did you?" "I found it," Rosie said, "at the north pasture, where they took the cattle." He nodded, his expression hardening. He knew he should have told her, should have warned her about Stone, about the danger, about the past. But he had held back, had tried to protect her, had hoped to keep her safe from the darkness that surrounded him. "I need to tell you something, Rosalie," he said, his voice strained, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. "Something about Stone, about my past." He led her into the ranch house, to the familiar living room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He sat down in the old rocking chair, his body tense, his hands clenched. Rosie sat opposite him, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She knew that this was a pivotal moment, a turning point, a revelation that would change everything. "Stone, he wasn't always my enemy," Coulter began, his voice low and strained, his gaze fixed on the flames. "We were friends once. Partners. We rode together, worked together, dreamed together." Rosie listened, her breath held captive in her chest, her eyes fixed on his face, on the pain etched into his features, the memories that haunted his eyes. "We came to Texas together," Coulter continued, his voice barely a whisper, "looking for a new life, for opportunity, for escape." He paused, his throat working, his eyes filled with a distant sadness. "We found it for a while. We built a small ranch, together. We worked hard, we prospered, we were happy." Rosie felt a pang of sympathy, a connection to this man who had once known friendship, partnership, happiness. She had glimpsed that side of him, the vulnerability, the capacity for love, the longing for connection. And then, she prompted, her voice gentle, encouraging. Coulter's expression darkened, his eyes hardening, his jaw clenching. "And then Sarah came into our lives." The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the weight of a past that had never been resolved. Rosie remembered the entry in his journal, the mention of Sarah, the woman he had loved, the woman he had lost. "She was beautiful," Coulter said, his voice choked with emotion. "Kind, gentle, full of life. We both fell in love with her." Rosie felt a jolt of something. Not jealousy, not exactly, but understanding. She understood the power of love, the intensity of desire, the devastation of loss. "And?" she prompted again, her voice barely a whisper. "And Stone betrayed me, Coulter said, his voice raw with pain, with anger, with betrayal.
He stole her from me.
He manipulated her, lied to her, turned her against me. He paused, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his hands clenched into fists. And then she died. She caught a fever. Stone, he wouldn't let me see her. He let her die alone. Rosie's heart ached for him. She understood now. The depth of his hatred for Stone, the source of his ruthlessness, his determination to protect himself, to never be vulnerable again. I am so sorry, Beau, she said, her voice filled with compassion, with empathy. He looked at her, his eyes filled with tears, tears he had held back for years, tears he had never allowed himself to shed. He took everything from me, Rosalie, he said, his voice broken. My friend, my love, my future. And I swore I'd make him pay. Rosie reached out, her hand covering his, her touch gentle, comforting. She felt the tension in his body, the rage, the grief, the pain. And now he's coming for you, she said, her voice firm. He's using me to get to you. Coulter nodded, his gaze meeting hers. I know. And I won't let him hurt you, Rosalie. I promise you that. The words hung in the air, a vow, a pledge, a declaration. It was the first time he had truly spoken from the heart, the first time he had shown her his true feelings, his love. But it was also a moment of broken trust, of bitter truths revealed. Rosie realized that she had been a pawn in a larger game, a game of revenge, of hatred, of obsession. She withdrew her hand, her heart aching, her mind reeling. She was caught between two men, two enemies, two forces of nature. And she had to choose. Choose between her past and her future, and where her heart truly belongs. Chapter 14. Flames of a Forbidden Desire. The revelation of Coulter's past, the bitter truth of his feud with Stone, cast a long shadow over Boone Ranch. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken threat of violence, with the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. Rosie found herself torn, her loyalties divided, her heart in turmoil. She had believed in Coulter, had trusted him, had fallen in love with him. But now, she saw him in a new light, as a man driven by revenge, a man consumed by hatred, a man capable of anything. She also saw him as a victim, a man who had suffered a terrible loss, a man who had been betrayed by his friend, a man who had had his heart broken. She understood his pain, his anger, his desire for justice. But she couldn't condone his methods, his ruthlessness, his obsession. She couldn't be a part of his vendetta, a pawn in his game of revenge. She confronted him, her voice firm, her eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disappointment. Why didn't you tell me, Beau? She asked, her voice trembling. Why didn't you trust me? Coulter looked at her, his expression pained, his eyes filled with regret. I wanted to protect you, Rosalie, he said, his voice strained. I didn't want you to get involved. I didn't want you to be in danger. But I am involved, Beau, Rosie said, her voice rising. I'm caught in the middle of your war. I'm a target, a prize to be won or lost. I won't let him hurt you, Coulter said, his voice fierce, his eyes blazing with determination. I swear it. But what about me, Beau? Rosie asked, her voice soft, pleading. What about my choices? My feelings? My heart? He looked at her, his gaze softening, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and despair. I care about you, Rosalie, he said, his voice barely a whisper. More than you know. More than I ever thought possible. But is it enough, Beau? Rosie asked, her voice choked with emotion. Is it enough to overcome the past? To break the cycle of hatred and revenge? He didn't answer, couldn't answer. He knew that he was trapped, caught between his desire for vengeance and his growing love for her. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. The touch, once a source of confusion and trepidation, now felt different. It was a touch of tenderness, of longing, of love. Rosie leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, her body swaying towards his. She couldn't deny the attraction, the pull, the desire that she felt for him. It was a forbidden desire, a dangerous desire, but it was real. He lowered his head, his lips brushing hers, a tentative touch, a hesitant exploration. Rosie's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs. She responded, her lips parting, welcoming his kiss, surrendering to the moment, to the passion that had been simmering beneath the surface. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more demanding, a release of pent-up emotions, of unspoken desires, of forbidden love. It was a kiss of fire, of passion, of desperation. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked, their bodies trembling. They knew that they had crossed a line, had stepped into dangerous territory, had succumbed to the flames of a forbidden desire. Rosalie Coulter began, his voice husky, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "Don't," Rosie said, her voice soft, placing a finger on his lips.
Don't say anything. Not now.
She knew that they couldn't ignore the reality of their situation, the conflict that divided them, the past that haunted them. But for now, in this moment, she wanted to forget, to lose herself in his arms, in his kiss, in his love. They spent the night together, in the old ranch house, in the room where she had grown up, in the bed where she had dreamed of a different future. They made love, with a tenderness, a passion, a desperation that surprised them both. It was a night of stolen moments, of forbidden pleasure, of shared vulnerability. It was a night that would change everything, a night that would bind them together, a night that would seal their fate. As the dawn approached, painting the sky with streaks of pink and orange, they lay in each other's arms, their bodies entwined, their hearts beating as one. They knew that the storm was coming, that the reckoning was inevitable, that their love was a fragile, precious thing, threatened by the darkness that surrounded them. But for now, in this moment, they were together, and that was all that mattered. They held on to their love in desperation. Chapter 15. The Unforgiving Hand of Fate. The fragile peace shattered with the abruptness of a lightning strike. A rider, one of Coulter's men, arrived at dawn, bearing news that sent a chill of dread through Rosie's heart. Stone had struck again, not at the ranch, but at Coulter's holdings in town, the bank, the saloon, the mercantile. He was systematically dismantling Coulter's empire, piece by piece, leaving a trail of destruction and chaos in his wake. Coulter, his face a mask of fury and determination, prepared to leave immediately. He was a man transformed, the tenderness of the night before replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He was going to war, and he would not return until Stone was defeated, until his vengeance was complete. Rosie watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and resignation. She knew that she couldn't stop him, couldn't dissuade him, couldn't change the course of events that had been set in motion years ago. "Beau," she said, her voice pleading, "please be careful. Don't let him win." He looked at her, his eyes softening for a moment, a flicker of the man she had come to love breaking through the hardened exterior. "I won't," he said, his voice firm. "I promise you. I'll come back. For you." He leaned down, his lips brushing hers, a brief, desperate kiss, a promise and a farewell all in one. Then, he mounted his horse and rode away, disappearing into the dust and the dawn, leaving Rosie alone with her fears, her doubts, her love. The days that followed were a torment of waiting, of uncertainty, of dread. Rosie tried to focus on the ranch, on the work, on the routine, but her mind was constantly elsewhere, imagining Coulter, fearing for his safety, wondering if she would ever see him again. Hemmings and the other hands watched her with concern, their faces etched with worry. They knew the situation, the danger, the stakes. They were loyal to Rosie, to Boone Ranch, but they also knew that Coulter was a force to be reckoned with, a man who would not be easily defeated. One evening, as Rosie was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, she saw a rider approaching in the distance. Her heart leaped with hope, then sank with dread. It wasn't Coulter. It was a stranger, a man she had never seen before, his face grim, his clothes dusty and torn. He dismounted, his movements stiff, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Miss Boone? He said, his voice rough. I have news. About Beau Coulter. Rosie's breath caught in her throat. She knew, instinctively, that it was bad news, terrible news, news that would change her life forever.
What is it?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper, her body trembling. There was a fight, the man said, his voice choked with emotion.
In town. Coulter and Stone. They killed each other.
The words hit Rosie like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her, sending her reeling. She felt a wave of nausea, of dizziness, of disbelief. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, it can't be. It's not true. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with pity. I'm sorry, Miss Boone. It's true. I saw it myself. They were both dead. In the street. Rosie felt her world crumble around her, her hopes, her dreams, her love, shattered into a million pieces. She felt a pain so intense, so overwhelming, that she thought she would die. She stumbled back, collapsing onto the porch steps, her body racked with sobs, her heart broken beyond repair. She had lost him, lost everything, lost the man she had come to love, the man who had promised to return. The unforgiving hand of fate had struck, claiming its victims, leaving a trail of destruction and despair. The feud, the hatred, the obsession had consumed them all, leaving Rosie alone, with nothing but her grief, her memories, her broken heart. She cried until she could cry no more. The hands must have heard, but kept their distance respectfully. Chapter 16. Riding through the storm. The news of Coulter's death spread like wildfire across the plains, leaving a trail of shock, disbelief, and uncertainty. The Bar C, once a symbol of power and stability, was now thrown into chaos, its future uncertain, its leadership gone. Rosie, consumed by grief, retreated into herself, withdrawing from the world, from the ranch, from life. She spent her days in the old ranch house, wandering through the rooms like a ghost, haunted by memories, by the echoes of laughter, by the ghost of Coulter. Hemmings and the other hands tried to reach her, to offer comfort, to help, but she pushed them away, unable to face the world, unable to accept the reality of her loss. Mrs. Coulter arrived at Boone Ranch, her face a mask of grief and anger. She had lost her son, her only child, the heir to her husband's legacy, the center of her world. She blamed Rosie, accusing her of bringing ruin upon the Coulter family, of being a curse, a temptress who had lured her son to his death. You, she hissed, her voice filled with venom, her eyes blazing with hatred. You did this. You brought this upon us. You killed him. Rosie, numb with grief, didn't respond, didn't defend herself, didn't care. She had lost everything, and nothing mattered anymore. Mrs. Coulter, consumed by her own grief and rage, ordered the Bar C hands to leave Boone Ranch, to return to their own land, to abandon Rosie. She was severing all ties, cutting off all support, leaving Rosie alone, with nothing but her broken heart and the ruins of her life. Hemmings and the Boone Ranch hands, loyal to Rosie, defied Mrs. Coulter's orders, refusing to leave, standing by her side, offering their support, their protection. We ain't going nowhere, Miss Rosie, Hemmings said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with determination. We're with you, always. We'll get through this. Together. Rosie looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, tears of gratitude, of love. She realized that she wasn't alone, that she still had something to live for, something to fight for. She had Boone Ranch, her family's legacy, her mother's promise. She had the loyal hands who had stood by her, who had offered their friendship, their support. She had herself, her strength, her resilience, her spirit. She rose from the depths of her despair, slowly, painfully, but surely. She began to emerge from her self-imposed exile, to face the world, to rebuild her life. She started by riding out, across the ranch, revisiting the familiar places, the places that held memories, the places that connected her to Coulter. She rode to the cemetery, to the grave where his sister was buried, the place where they had shared a moment of connection, of understanding. She stood there, in silence, remembering him, grieving for him, but also drawing strength from his memory, from his love. She rode to the north pasture, where she had found the concho, the evidence of Stone's betrayal, the catalyst of Coulter's final, fatal confrontation. She stood there, looking out across the land, feeling the wind in her hair, the sun on her face, the spirit of the frontier. She realized that she couldn't let grief consume her, couldn't let the past define her, couldn't let Coulter's death be in vain. She had to move forward, to live, to honor his memory, to fulfill her own destiny. She returned to the ranch house, her heart still heavy, but her spirit renewed, her determination strengthened. She gathered the hands together, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a new light.
"We have work to do," she said.
"We have a ranch to run, a legacy to protect, a future to build. We'll do it together. We'll honor Coulter's memory by surviving, by thriving, by living." The hands, inspired by her courage, her resilience, her spirit, responded with a resounding cheer, a pledge of loyalty, a promise of support. Rosie knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that she would face challenges, obstacles, setbacks. But she also knew that she was not alone, that she had the strength, the courage, the determination to overcome anything. She was Rosalie Boone, mistress of Boone Ranch, a woman of the frontier, a woman of strength and resilience, a woman who had loved and lost, but who would rise again. She would ride through the storm. She would find the sun. She would feel the breeze. She would live on. Chapter 17. Between Law and Loyalty. The uneasy quiet that had settled over Boone Ranch after Coulter's death was shattered by the arrival of the law. Sheriff Thompson, a man known for his gruff demeanor and unwavering adherence to the letter of the law, rode in with a posse of deputies, their faces grim, their intentions clear. They were investigating the deaths of Coulter and Stone, the violence that had erupted in town, the chaos that had engulfed the community. They were seeking answers, seeking justice, seeking someone to blame. Rosie met them at the gate, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She knew that this was a dangerous situation, a precarious moment, a test of her loyalty, her courage, her resolve. "Miss Boone," Thompson said, his voice harsh, his eyes narrowed. "We need to ask you some questions. About Coulter.
About Stone.
About what happened." Rosie nodded, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll cooperate, Sheriff. But I have nothing to hide." Thompson grunted, unconvinced. He dismounted, his movements stiff, his gaze sweeping across the ranch, taking in the details, the atmosphere. "We know about your arrangement with Coulter," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "That you were his betrothed.
His property."
Rosie's jaw tightened. She hated the way he phrased it, the implication that she was nothing more than a possession, a pawn in a man's game. "It was a business arrangement, Sheriff," she said, her voice tight. "To save my family's ranch." "And yet you grew close to him," Thompson said, his voice probing, his eyes searching hers. "You cared for him." Rosie hesitated, her heart aching with the memory of Coulter, with the love she had felt for him, a love that had been cut short, a love that was now forbidden. He was a good man, Sheriff," she said, her voice barely a whisper.
"Despite everything."
Thompson raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "A good man?" "He was a ruthless cattle baron, Miss Boone. A man with enemies, a man with a violent past." "He had his reasons, Sheriff," Rosie said, her voice firm. "He was protecting what was his. He was defending himself." "Against Stone?" Thompson asked, his voice sharp. "A man he had a history with. A man he hated." Rosie nodded, her gaze meeting his.
"Yes."
"Stone, he was the aggressor. He started it." Thompson looked at her, his gaze intense, trying to decipher the truth, to separate fact from fiction, to unravel the web of lies and deceit that surrounded the case. "And you were caught in the middle," he said, his voice softening slightly. "A pawn in their game. A victim." Rosie shook her head, her voice firm. "I was not a victim, Sheriff. I made my choices. I stood by Coulter. I loved him. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the weight of a truth that was both dangerous and liberating. Thompson studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He saw the strength in her eyes, the determination, the grief. He saw a woman who had been through hell, who had lost everything, who was still standing. I believe you, Miss Boone, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. But the law is the law, and I have a job to do. He explained that there were complications. Stone's family was powerful, influential, and they were demanding justice, demanding retribution. They were claiming that Coulter had murdered Stone, that he had been the aggressor, that Rosie was an accomplice. Rosie felt a chill run down her spine. She realized the danger she was in, the precariousness of her situation. She was caught between two powerful forces, between the law and loyalty, between justice and love. I need your help, Miss Boone, Thompson said, his voice earnest. I need you to testify, to tell the truth about what happened, to help me bring closure to this case. Rosie hesitated, her mind racing. She knew that testifying against Stone's family would be dangerous, that it would put her life at risk, that it would betray Coulter's memory, in a way. But she also knew that it was the right thing to do, the only way to bring peace to the community, to honor the truth, to find justice. I'll do it, Sheriff, she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with determination. I'll tell the truth. I'll testify. Thompson nodded, relief evident in his eyes. Thank you, Miss Boone. You're a brave woman. Brave, or foolish, or desperate, or in love. Chapter 18. The Cost of Freedom's Call. The decision to testify against Stone's family weighed heavily on Rosie. It was a choice fraught with danger, a path that could lead to retribution, to violence, to the loss of everything she had fought so hard to protect. She knew that Stone's family was powerful, influential, and ruthless. They would not hesitate to silence her, to eliminate any threat to their reputation, their power. They would see her as a traitor, an enemy, a loose end. But she also knew that she couldn't remain silent, couldn't let lies and deceit prevail, couldn't betray the truth, the memory of Coulter, the love she had felt for him. She confided in Hemmings, seeking his counsel, his support, his wisdom. He listened patiently, his weathered face etched with concern, his eyes filled with understanding. Miss Rosie, he said, his voice low, his hand resting on her shoulder. This is a dangerous road you're talking. Stone's family, they ain't gonna let this go. They'll come after you. I know, Hemmings, Rosie said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. But I have to do it. It's the right thing to do. It's what Coulter would have wanted. Hemmings sighed, his gaze filled with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. He would have wanted you safe, Miss Rosie. He wouldn't have wanted you to risk your life. I'm not afraid, Hemmings, Rosie said, her voice resolute, her eyes blazing with determination.
Eve faced vers. Eve survived.
I'll do it again. Hemmings nodded, his respect for her unwavering. We're with you, Miss Rosie. Always. We'll protect you. We'll fight with you. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with tension, with anticipation, with dread. Rosie prepared herself, mentally and emotionally, for the ordeal, for the confrontation, for the truth. She spent hours reviewing the events, the details, the evidence. She rehearsed her testimony, anticipating the questions, the challenges, the accusations. She also spent time alone, riding across the ranch, seeking solace in the familiar landscape, drawing strength from the land, from the memory of her mother, from the spirit of Coulter. She visited his grave, not the one on the Bar Sea, but an imaginary one, a place in her heart where she had buried him, where she had mourned him, where she had loved him. Beau, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I'm doing this for you. For us. For the truth. I won't let you down.
I promise.
The day of the hearing arrived, a day of reckoning, a day of truth. Rosie rode into town with Hemmings and a few of the loyal hands, their faces grim, their determination unwavering. The town was buzzing with activity, with anticipation, with tension. The courthouse was packed, filled with people from all walks of life, ranchers, townsfolk, lawmen, and Stone's family. Rosie saw them, the Stones, their faces cold, their eyes filled with hatred, their presence menacing. They were a powerful force, a family with a reputation for violence, for ruthlessness, for getting their way. She felt a shiver of fear, but she pushed it aside, steeling herself for the ordeal, for the confrontation, for the truth. She entered the courthouse, her head held high, her shoulders squared, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She was Rosalie Boone, mistress of Boone Ranch, a woman of the frontier, a woman of strength and resilience, a woman who would not be intimidated, a woman who would speak the truth. The hearing began, a tense, dramatic affair, filled with accusations, denials, and revelations. Rosie took the stand, her heart pounding, her voice trembling slightly, but firm. She told her story, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She spoke of her arrangement with Coulter, of his feud with Stone, of the wrestling, of the final, fatal confrontation. She spoke of Coulter's past, of his love for Sarah, of Stone's betrayal, of the years of hatred and revenge. She spoke of her own feelings, of her growing love for Coulter, of her grief at his loss. Stone's family's lawyer, a slick, silver-tongued man, tried to discredit her, to paint her as a liar, a manipulator, a woman scorned. He challenged her testimony, questioned her motives, accused her of complicity. But Rosie held her ground, her voice unwavering, her eyes fixed on the truth. She answered his questions honestly, directly, without hesitation, without fear. She presented the evidence, the concho, the symbol of Stone's involvement, the proof of his guilt. The courtroom was silent, captivated by her testimony, by her courage, by her truth. The jury, a group of 12 men and women, listened intently, their faces etched with concentration, with judgment. The hearing lasted for hours, a grueling ordeal, a test of Rosie's strength, her resilience, her resolve. But she endured, she persevered, she prevailed. In the end, the jury delivered their verdict. Stone had been the aggressor, Coulter had acted in self-defense, and Rosie was exonerated. Justice had been served, the truth had been revealed, and Rosie was free. But freedom had come at a cost, and she felt it more intensely now. Chapter 19. Where Shadows Meet the Dawn. The aftermath of the hearing was a whirlwind of emotions, of relief, of exhaustion, of lingering grief. Rosie, vindicated but weary, returned to Boone Ranch, seeking solace in the familiar landscape, in the quiet solitude of her home. The threat of Stone's family was diminished, their power broken, their reputation tarnished. But the scars of the past remained, the memories of violence, of loss, of betrayal. Rosie knew that she would never fully escape the shadow of Coulter, of Stone, of the feud that had consumed their lives. But she also knew that she had to move forward, to rebuild, to create a new future, a future free from the darkness of the past. She threw herself into the work of the ranch, finding purpose in the daily tasks, in the connection to the land, in the loyalty of the hands. She made plans for the future, for improvements, for expansion, for a new beginning. She also began to heal. Slowly, painfully, but surely. The wounds of grief began to close. The sharp edges of pain began to soften. The memories of Coulter began to change. She no longer saw him as a ghost, a haunting presence, a symbol of loss. She saw him as a man, flawed and complex, a man who had loved and lost, a man who had fought for what he believed in. She remembered his strength, his courage, his vulnerability. She remembered his touch, his kiss, his love. She realized that he would always be a part of her heart, a part of her story. But he would no longer define her, consume her, hold her captive. One evening, as she was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, she saw a rider approaching in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat, a flicker of hope, of disbelief. It couldn't be. He was gone.
Dead.
But as the rider drew closer, she recognized the horse, the familiar black stallion, Diablo. And then, She recognized the rider, the tall, broad-shouldered figure, the unmistakable silhouette. It was Coulter.
Alive.
Rosie rose from her chair, her legs trembling, her heart pounding, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe her eyes, couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. It was a mirage, a hallucination, a dream. But then, he dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, his presence real. He walked towards her, his spurs jingling softly with each step, his eyes searching hers. "Rosalie," he said, his voice low, husky, filled with emotion. "Beau," she whispered, her voice choked, her eyes filled with tears. It's really you." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. The touch, familiar and real, sent a jolt of electricity through her, confirming the impossible, the miracle. "It's me," he said, his voice trembling slightly.
I'm alive.
Rosie threw herself into his arms, her body shaking with sobs, her heart overflowing with joy, with relief, with love. She held him tight, clinging to him, afraid to let go, afraid that he would disappear again, that this was just a dream. He held her close, his arms strong and protective, his body warm and real. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent, feeling her warmth, her love.
How?
Rosie asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "How is this possible?" He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers, his expression serious. "It's a long story, Rosalie," he said. "A story of deception, of secrets, of survival." He explained that he had known Stone was planning something, that he had anticipated the attack, that he had prepared for it. He had arranged for a double, a man who resembled him, to take his place in town, to draw Stone out, to end the feud once and for all. The man who had died in the street, the man everyone believed was Coulter, was the double. Coulter had been watching, hidden, waiting for the right moment to intervene. But Stone had been faster, deadlier, than he had anticipated. He had killed the double, and Coulter, in turn, had killed Stone. But he had been wounded badly. He had managed to escape, to hide, to recover. He had been nursed back to health by a recluse, an old woman who lived in the hills, a woman who owed him a favor. He had stayed hidden, letting the world believe he was dead, waiting for the right moment to return. He had needed time to heal, to plan, to decide what to do.
And now?
Rosie asked, her voice hesitant, her eyes searching his.
What now, Beau?
He smiled, a slow, genuine smile, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that transformed his face. "Now we start over," he said, his voice firm, his eyes filled with hope. "We build a new life. Together. If you'll have me." Rosie's heart soared. She looked at him, at the man she loved, the man who had returned from the dead, the man who was offering her a future. "I'll have you, Beau Coulter," she said, her voice filled with love, with joy, with promise. "Always." He kissed her then, a long, slow, passionate kiss, a kiss of reunion, of hope, of love. The shadows of the past receded, replaced by the dawn of a new day, a new beginning, a new love. The embrace was everything. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The return of Beau Coulter sent ripples of shock and awe through the community, a resurrection that defied belief, a miracle that whispered of second chances. The Bar C, once shrouded in uncertainty, was once again under his command, his presence a reassurance, a symbol of strength and resilience. But the past, though seemingly buried, cast long shadows. Mrs. Coulter, initially overwhelmed with relief at her son's survival, soon reverted to her old ways, her resentment towards Rosie rekindled, fueled by the lingering suspicion that she had somehow played a part in the deception. "You knew," she accused Rosie, her voice sharp, her eyes filled with cold disapproval. "You knew he was alive. You helped him." Rosie, weary of the accusations, of the constant battle for acceptance, stood her ground. "I didn't know, Mrs. Coulter," she said, her voice firm, her gaze unwavering. "I believed he was dead. Just like you." Mrs. Coulter scoffed, unconvinced. You expect me to believe that? You, a woman who traded herself for a debt, a woman who bewitched my son? Bo intervened, his voice firm, his presence commanding. Mother, that's enough. Rosalie had nothing to do with it. It was my decision, my plan. And she's my wife. You will treat her with respect. Mrs. Coulter glared at him, her resentment palpable, but she subsided, silenced by his authority, by his love for Rosie. The tension between them remained, a simmering undercurrent of disapproval, a constant reminder of the past, of the obstacles they still faced. But Rosie and Bo were determined to build a new life, a life together, a life based on love, on trust, on mutual respect. They worked side by side, rebuilding the Barcy, restoring its glory, expanding its reach. They rode the range together, shared meals together, planned for the future together. They also faced the lingering threat of Stone's family, the possibility of retaliation, of revenge. But they faced it together, united, strong, and determined. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of the Barcy ranch house, watching the sunset, Bo turned to Rosie, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. Thank you, Rosalie, he said, his voice low, his hand reaching for hers.
For everything.
For believing in me, for standing by me, for loving me. Rosie smiled, her heart overflowing with love. Thank you, Bo, she said, her voice soft, her fingers intertwining with his. For coming back to me, for giving us a second chance. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers, a tender kiss, a promise of a future, a declaration of love. I love you, Rosalie Boone, he said, his voice husky, his eyes filled with emotion. More than words can say. And I love you, Bo Coulter, Rosie replied, her voice choked with emotion, her heart full. They knew that their journey would not be easy, that they would face challenges, obstacles, setbacks. But they also knew that they would face them together, united by their love, by their strength, by their shared destiny. They would build a new life, a life based on honesty, on trust, on mutual respect. They would create a legacy of love, of resilience, of hope. They would honor the past, but they would not be defined by it. They would learn from their mistakes, from their losses, from their triumphs. They would ride through the storms, they would find the sun, they would feel the breeze, they would live. And they would love, deeply, passionately, and forever. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple, they stood together, hand in hand, their hearts entwined, their souls united. They were Rosalie and Bo Coulter, masters of their own destiny, a couple forged in the fires of adversity, a love story written in the dust and blood of the frontier, a testament to the power of hope, of resilience, of love. The final showdown, the real one, was done. Epilogue. Years passed, seasons turning, painting the Texas landscape with the cyclical brushstrokes of time. Boone Ranch and the Barcy, once separate entities, symbols of a divided past, merged into one, a testament to the enduring power of love and forgiveness. Rosie and Bo, their bond strengthened by the trials they had overcome, stood at the helm, their hands intertwined, their hearts forever bound. The scars of the past remained, etched into the land, into their memories, into the lines on their faces. But they were no longer wounds, open and raw, but rather badges of honor, reminders of the battles fought, the losses endured, the triumphs celebrated. Mrs. Coulter, her heart softened by time and the undeniable love between her son and Rosie, eventually found a measure of peace, accepting Rosie not as an interloper, but as a daughter, a strong, capable woman who had brought new life and purpose to the Coulter legacy. The threat of Stone's family faded into the annals of history, their power diminished, their vengeance forgotten. The frontier, though still wild and untamed, began to yield to the forces of progress, of civilization, of change. Rosie and Bo welcomed children into their world, a son and a daughter, who inherited the spirit of the frontier, the love of the land, the bond of family. They raised them with a blend of tenderness and discipline, teaching them the values of hard work, honesty, and compassion. The ranch house, once filled with shadows and unspoken words, now echoed with laughter, with music, with life. The dining room, once a stage for formal dinners and strained conversations, became a gathering place for family and friends, a place of warmth, of connection, of love. Rosie and Beau, their hair streaked with silver, their bodies weathered by time, but their spirits unbroken, often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, reminiscing about the past, dreaming of the future. They remembered the hardships, the challenges, the losses. But they also remembered the triumphs, the joys, the love. They had built a life together, a life that had defied the odds, a life that had overcome adversity, a life that was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. One evening, as they were sitting hand in hand, watching the stars emerge in the vast Texas sky, Beau turned to Rosie, his eyes filled with a love that had only deepened with time. "We did it, Rosalie," he said, his voice soft, his hand squeezing hers. "We made it." Rosie smiled, her heart overflowing with gratitude. "Yes, Beau," she said, her voice choked with emotion.
We did.
They had ridden through the storm, they had found the sun, they had felt the breeze, they had lived. And they had loved, deeply, passionately, and forever. Their story, a legend whispered across the plains, a testament to the enduring power